The morning began like any other. The sun rose gently, casting a warm, golden light through the small curtains of the old woman's modest home. She had lived in the same neighborhood for decades, watching children grow into adults, families come and go, and the world around her changed faster than she could ever imagine. Despite the changes, her routine never wavered. She liked to wake up early, brew a fresh cup of tea, and sit by the window to watch the streets slowly come alive. At 76 years old, her movements were slower than they once were, but her spirit was still strong. Neighbors often admired her independence, how she still cooked her own meals, walked to the market, and greeted everyone with a warm smile. She had raised her children here, seen hard times, and survived challenges that many people her age might never speak of. Life had not been easy, but she had always carried herself with quiet dignity and grace. That morning, she looked at the clock after finishing her tea. It was almost time to go to the local grocery store. She needed bread, a few vegetables, and some milk. With careful hands, she put on her light jacket, slipped her purse over her shoulder, and picked up her cane. She didn't need it for every step, but she kept it with her for balance, just in case her knees gave her trouble. Before leaving, she checked the small framed photos on the table near her door. There was one of her late husband, gone many years now, and another of her son, the pride of her life, smiling in his military uniform. She whispered a small prayer for him, as she did every day, and then stepped outside. The neighborhood was busy now. Children were running, chasing one another before school started. A young mother pushed a stroller, nodding politely as she passed by. Cars rolled down the street, some in a hurry, others slowing to let pedestrians cross. The old woman walked at her own pace, slow but steady. People knew her well. Some waved, others stopped to say hello, and she always returned the greeting. She was the kind of elder who made others feel safe, simply by being around. Her presence was gentle, yet strong. Not at the market, she carefully selected what she needed. She inspected the vegetables, checked the bread for freshness, and exchanged small talk with the cashier, who always smiled at her stories. She wasn't just another customer, she was part of the fabric of this community. People respected her age, her wisdom, and the kindness she showed. When she paid, she counted her money carefully. Not because she didn't trust the cashier, but because it was a habit she had carried for years. She liked to be precise. With her bag of groceries, she started walking back home. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of flowers from a nearby garden. She thought about making a simple soup for dinner, something warm and comforting. As she walked, memories of her younger days floated into her mind. She remembered holding her son's small hand when he was a child, leading him down these same streets. Now, he was a grown man, a soldier with medals, a hero in the eyes of many. Though he lived far away, she always felt his presence in her heart. It was an ordinary day, filled with ordinary tasks, yet there was something special in the simplicity. She loved these moments, the walks, the greetings, the chance to still be a part of the world around her. At her age, every ordinary day was also a blessing. She never knew what tomorrow would bring, but she cherished each step she could still take on her own. As she neared her street, she slowed down to adjust her bag and leaned on her cane for a moment. A group of teenagers passed by, their laughter loud and carefree. One of them offered to help carry her groceries, but she politely declined, saying she was strong enough. They respected her answer and smiled before running off. She couldn't help but smile back, proud that even in her old age, she still carried herself with strength. To her, it was just another day in a long life of many days. She did not know that this simple routine, this walk to the market and back, would soon take a turn she could never have predicted. What started as an ordinary day, calm and peaceful, was about to become unforgettable. And though she did not yet realize it, her strength, her dignity, and her family's legacy were about to be tested in ways that would shake the entire neighborhood. Asterisk. The woman's walk home was steady and calm, her bag of groceries swinging gently at her side. The world felt predictable, safe, and familiar until she noticed two police cars slowly turning onto her street. Their flashing lights were off, but their sudden presence shifted the air. The sound of tires crunching against the road made her pause for a moment. She thought nothing of it at first. After all, she had lived long enough to see countless patrols pass through her neighborhood. But this time, the cars didn't pass by. They stopped. Two officers stepped out, their uniforms crisp, their expressions sharp and serious. They scanned the area quickly, their eyes landing on her almost immediately. She clutched her cane and blinked, confused. Why were they looking at her like that? "Ma'am," one officer called, his tone not polite but commanding. "We need to speak with you." The elderly woman froze. She had never been in trouble with the law a day in her life. In fact, she had spent her years teaching her children to respect authority, to follow rules, and to always keep their heads high in the face of difficulty. Her heart thumped as the officers walked toward her, their boots heavy against the pavement. "Yes, officers," she replied softly, her voice trembling but steady enough to show respect. "Can we see some identification?" the taller officer demanded. His eyes narrowed as if he already believed she had done something wrong. Her brows furrowed. "Identification? For what reason?" she asked carefully. "You fit the description of a suspect." The second officer cut in, his tone sharp and dismissive. "We've had reports of a woman involved in a crime nearby. Elderly, dark clothing, walking with a bag. That matches you." The woman's mouth opened slightly, stunned at the absurdity of the claim. She had just returned from the market. Her bag contained bread, vegetables, and milk. She was a grandmother, a churchgoer, a neighbor known for her kindness. How could anyone confuse her with a criminal? "There must be some mistake," she said gently, holding her bag a little higher to show them. "I only went to the store," but her words seemed invisible. The officers exchanged a quick glance, as if they had already decided her fate. The taller one stepped closer, his hand hovering near his belt. "We'll need you to come with us," he said firmly. Fear gripped her chest. The weight of years of history, of injustices she had read about and sometimes witnessed, suddenly pressed down on her. She had heard of these things happening to others, but never thought it would happen to her Hain old woman who had lived her life with honesty and dignity. "I assure you, I have done nothing wrong," she insisted. Her voice firmer now, though her hands shook slightly. "Please, let me show you my receipt from the market." But the officers weren't listening. One reached out, taking hold of her arm without care for her frailty. The sudden pressure made her wince. "We'll sort it out downtown," he said. A few neighbors began to notice what was happening. A man across the street paused with his lawnmower. A woman carrying groceries herself stopped in her tracks, watching the scene with wide eyes. Whispers spread quickly, confusion rippling through the block. The elderly woman's face flushed with humiliation. To be treated like this, in front of people who had known her for years, was unbearable. She had lived long enough to know the sting of disrespect. But this was different. This was public, degrading, and frightening. She tried once more, her voice rising slightly. "Please, I am not who you are looking for. I am just going home." But her plea was dismissed as if it were nothing more than background noise. The officers reached for handcuffs. The cold metal clicked, the sound slicing through the silence of the watching crowd. The old woman's eyes watered not just from fear, but from disbelief. After a lifetime of being a law-abiding citizen, after raising a son who became a decorated soldier for his country, here she was, being treated like a criminal. Her cane clattered to the ground as they tightened the cuffs around her thin wrists. Pain shot up her arm, but what hurt more was the loss of dignity. She looked at the ground, embarrassed, wishing her late husband could be there to hold her hand and give her strength. One of the neighbors finally spoke up. "She's lived here for decades. She didn't do anything wrong." But the officers ignored the voices around them. Their focus was on getting her into the car. The elderly woman took a deep breath. She knew fighting would only make things worse. But she also knew she wasn't powerless. There was one thing she could do, one person she could call who would never let injustice go unanswered. She gathered what little strength she had and spoke in a voice that carried surprising firmness. "I want to make a phone call," she said, her eyes locking with the officers. "You cannot deny me that." The taller officer hesitated. The request seemed harmless enough. "Fine," he muttered, pulling out his phone and holding it toward her. "One call. Make it quick." Her hands trembled as she dialed the number she knew by heart. The number of her son. The man who had fought battles across the world. The man who carried not only medals on his chest, but the spirit of honor, discipline, and justice in his very soul. The phone rang once, twice, then came the deep, steady voice of her son. "Hello." She closed her eyes, relief flooding through her. "Son," she whispered, her voice breaking. "They've taken me." And in that moment, the ordinary day shattered completely. The police car door shut with a heavy thud. And the elderly woman felt the cold, metallic echo travel through her bones. She sat on the hard seat in the back, her wrists bound tightly in steel cuffs that bit into her thin skin. The windows were tinted, but she could still see glimpses of her neighborhood familiar houses. Friendly face splashing past as the car pulled away. Each sight pierced her heart. This was her home, her safe place, and yet here she was, leaving it as if she were a criminal. Her groceries had been left behind, scattered on the sidewalk. The bread had fallen out of the bag, and her cane lay forgotten on the ground. She thought of how embarrassing it must have looked, the strong, independent woman they all once knew, now being driven away in handcuffs. Shame, heavy and suffocating, pressed against her chest. In the front seat, the two officers spoke in low tones. Their words were sharp, filled with certainty that they had caught the right person. She wanted to scream, to beg them to listen, but she knew her voice would only be swallowed by the hum of the engine. Instead, she stared at her wrinkled hands, still trembling, and tried to steady her breathing. Her mind drifted back to her son. She had spoken to him on the phone only minutes ago. His voice had been calm, but carried an unmistakable edge of concern. She knew him well enough to understand what was happening. He was already preparing to act. That thought gave her strength, but only a little. For now, she was alone in this cage on wheels, rolling toward an uncertain fate. The station was not far, but the drive felt endless. When the car finally stopped, the door was yanked open. One officer pulled her out roughly, forgetting nor perhaps not caring that she was elderly. She stumbled but caught herself before she fell. Her dignity still intact. Inside, the bright fluorescent lights of the police station made her squint. The walls were cold, painted in dull colors that made the place feel lifeless. The air smelled of ink, sweat, and stale coffee. Other officers looked up as she was escorted in, some with curiosity, others with indifference. To them, she was just another suspect, just another case. The officers led her to a small room with a metal table and 2 chairs. They sat her down, not bothering to remove the cuffs. Her wrists ached, but she didn't complain. Complaints, she knew, would fall on deaf ears. She had lived long enough to know when people had already made up their minds. "Name?" one officer asked, flipping open a notebook. She gave it softly. "Age?" 76, she replied. That number seemed to hang in the air, but neither officer reacted with sympathy. They continued, as if she were a young suspect who could still run from them, still cause harm. "Where were you at approximately 11 a.m. this morning?" Her voice grew firmer. "At the market. I bought bread, vegetables, and milk." You can ask the cashier. Everyone there saw me. The officers exchanged a glance. One scribbled in the notebook while the other leaned back, arms crossed. "We'll check on that," he muttered, though his tone suggested he didn't believe her. Minutes dragged on. The questions felt repetitive, almost rehearsed. They weren't looking for answers. They were looking for something to pin on her. The old woman realized this and sat quietly, conserving her energy. But inside, her heart was heavy. She thought of her late husband and how he would have fought for her. She thought of her neighbors, some of whom surely worried about her even now. And she thought of her son, the decorated Green Beret, the soldier who had faced war zones, who had survived battles that tested the limits of human courage. He had fought enemies abroad, yet now his own mother was being treated like one back home. The irony burned within her. She imagined his face when he arrived, the fire in his eyes, the calm authority in his voice. He was a man who commanded respect wherever he went, and she knew the officers here had no idea who they were dealing with. Time crawled by. The officers left her alone in the room at one point, the door clicking shut behind them. She sat in silence, the hum of the overhead light the only sound. Her hands rested on the cold table, and she whispered a prayer under her breath. Out in the main room, voices grew louder. Phones rang. Radios crackled. The normal chaos of a police station carried on. But among all that noise, a storm was brewing, though the officers didn't yet know it. Her son was coming. Back in the small room, the elderly woman straightened in her chair. Her back ached, her wrists throbbed, but her spirit refused to break. She was not just a suspect, not just an old woman wrongly accused. She was a mother, and the mother of a warrior. That fact alone gave her strength to endure the humiliation. Soon, she thought, the truth will come. And when it does, these men who see me as nothing will realize the weight of their mistake. She closed her eyes for a moment, exhaling slowly. This was more than just wrongful detainment. It was a test of patience, of dignity, and of the unshakable bond between a mother and her son. What she didn't know was that outside the walls of the station, her son was already on his way, his decorated past and iron will ready to collide with the injustice unfolding here. And nothing, not even the strongest badge, could stand in his way. The small interrogation room felt like a prison cell. The elderly woman sat silently, her wrists still bound, her dignity held together only by sheer will. The overhead light flickered faintly, casting harsh shadows across the cold metal table. She could hear muffled voices outside, the occasional laugh of an officer who had the comfort of knowing he was free. But inside, time felt frozen. Every minute that passed in silence weighed heavily on her chest. She knew she couldn't endure this much longer. Her son's voice from earlier echoed in her memory. He had answered her call with calmness, but beneath that calm was fire. She had heard it before, back when he was younger and unshakable in his resolve. As a boy, he had always rushed to protect her from harm, no matter how small. Now, as a man decorated, respected, and feared on the battlefield, he carried the same protective fire, but magnified 1,000 times. The woman adjusted herself in the chair, her cuffs rattling against the table. She remembered how, just before they brought her in, she had begged for one call. That single moment was her lifeline, her only chance to reach beyond these walls. When they reluctantly placed the phone in her hands, she had dialed the number without hesitation. The familiar digits slid off her fingertips like muscle memory. The line had rung twice before he answered. "Hello?" His deep, steady voice filled her ears like a shield. "Son." Her voice had broken then, fragile and trembling. "They've taken me." For a moment, silence stretched on the other end. She imagined him closing his eyes, fighting to stay calm while fury surged inside him. Then his reply came, steady but edged with steel. "Where are you, Mama?" At the police station, she whispered. Her voice cracked with both fear and relief. They say I did something, but I didn't. I swear to you, I only went to the market. I know, he said firmly, leaving no space for doubt. His words wrapped around her like armor. Listen to me. Stay calm. Say nothing more. I'm on my way. The call had ended, but its effect lingered. Her hands still shook, but now there was a spark in her chest, a fragile but powerful flame of hope. She was no longer entirely alone. Somewhere beyond these walls, her son was moving, preparing, determined to reach her. She knew him better than anyone. His whole life had been built on discipline, honor, and action. From the time he enlisted as a young man to the years he had spent earning medals and recognition as one of the most decorated Green Berets alive, he had never backed down from a challenge. He had faced enemies with weapons in their hands, leaders with power in their words, and situations where survival was uncertain. Compared to those battles, this one was different, but perhaps even more personal. This was about his mother. Inside the station, the officers thought they had control. They believed their badges gave them authority beyond question. But what they didn't realize was that their actions had triggered something far greater than they could handle. They had humiliated a woman whose life had been lived with honor, and in doing so, they had summoned a man whose very existence was a testament to courage and strength. The elderly woman sat back in her chair, her eyes fixed on the door. She could almost hear his footsteps already, steady and purposeful. The memory of his words, "I'm on my," wailed in her mind, giving her the patience to endure the humiliation. She thought of the times he had stood tall in uniform, medals glinting against his chest, saluted by men younger and older than him alike. To the world, he was a hero. But to her, he was still the little boy who had once held her hand while crossing the street, who promised he'd always protect her, and now he was about to keep that promise. Outside, as the sun dipped lower in the sky, a powerful vehicle roared down the street toward the station. Inside it sat the Green Beret himself, eyes sharp, jaw tight, hands gripping the steering wheel. He was calm, but beneath that calm was the kind of determination only forged in the harshest of battles. His mind replayed his mother's trembling words, every syllable igniting his fury. He had fought enemies across the world, but this was different. This was home. This was his mother. And no force on earth would keep him from her. Back in the room, the elderly woman closed her eyes. For a brief moment, she let herself breathe. She whispered softly to herself, a prayer for courage. She had endured shame, humiliation, and fear. But now she felt the tide turning. Her son was coming, and when he walked through those doors, everything would change. The drive to the police station was a blur. Though the man behind the wheel registered every detail with military precision, his heart pounded with a steady, controlled rhythm, but his mind was a storm. He had learned long ago, through years of grueling training and missions that tested every fiber of his being, how to master fear and anger. But tonight, it wasn't about enemies in distant lands. It wasn't about strategy or combat. This was about his mother. Her voice still echoed in his ears, fragile and trembling. They've taken me. He had fought in deserts, jungles, and mountains. But those three words cut deeper than any bullet ever had. For the first time in years, he felt the sting of helplessness only for a second, though, because helplessness had no place in his life. Action replaced it, as it always had. When he finally turned into the parking lot of the police station, his eyes sharpened. The building stood there, ordinary to anyone else, but to him it was a battlefield. Its walls concealed the injustice committed against the one person he loved most in this world. He killed the engine, stepped out of his vehicle, and straightened his posture. Even in civilian clothes, he carried himself with the authority of a soldier, a man who had seen things few could imagine. As he entered the station, conversations quieted. Officers glanced up from their desks, some out of curiosity, others sensing something in his presence. He didn't storm in shouting. He didn't need to. His silence was commanding, his gaze sharp enough to make men twice his size uncomfortable. "I'm here for my mother," he said, his voice low but heavy with intent. The desk sergeant blinked, fumbling with a folder. "Your mother. She was brought in less than an hour ago. Elderly, wrongfully detained." His tone left no room for doubt. "Take me to her." Now, the sergeant hesitated. Most civilians would have begged or pleaded, but this man was different. His eyes carried a weight the sergeant couldn't dismiss. He knew instantly that he wasn't dealing with just any son. This was someone trained. Someone who understood authority better than most officers in the room. Reluctantly, the sergeant motioned to one of the younger officers. "Go get the woman from Holding." The Green Beret's jaw clenched. Holding. The word itself was an insult. He imagined his frail mother sitting in some cold room, treated like a criminal, her wrists bruised by metal cuffs, his fists curled at his sides. But he forced himself to remain still. Discipline. Always discipline. Minutes later, the door opened and they brought her out. She looked smaller than he remembered. Sitting in that chair, her wrists bound, her eyes weary but unbroken. When their gazes met, she straightened instantly, as if his presence alone gave her back her strength. "Son," she whispered. Relief washing over her face. He stepped forward, his voice calm but edged with steel. "Take those cuffs off her now." The younger officer hesitated. "Sir." I said now." His tone carried the unmistakable authority of a man used to commanding soldiers in life-or-death situations. It wasn't loud, but it was absolute. The officer fumbled with the keys and quickly unlocked the cuffs. The old woman rubbed her wrists, the red marks standing out against her skin. Her son gently took her hands, examining the bruises, his expression hardening with each second. "What's the charge?" he asked, his eyes never leaving the marks on her skin. One of the officers spoke up. She matched the description of a suspect. He cut him off with a sharp glance. "A 76-year-old grandmother carrying groceries. That's your suspect?" His voice was sharp now, slicing through the room. Silence fell. The officers shifted uncomfortably. Some avoided his gaze entirely. "You humiliated her," he continued, his tone steady but his anger unmistakable. "You put her in cuffs. You treated her like a criminal. And for what? Because she matched a description. That's your excuse." No one answered. The Green Beret's reputation had preceded him many times in his life. But here, these men didn't seem to know who he was. Still, his presence demanded respect. He didn't need to flash medals or recite his service record. His very stance, the fire in his eyes, the control in his voice, it all spoke louder than any decoration pinned to his chest. Turning back to his mother, he softened for the first time since entering. "You're safe now," he murmured. "I'm here." Her eyes glistened. Despite the humiliation, despite the pain, she smiled faintly. In her heart, she had always known this moment would come. Her son had never failed her, not as a child, not as a soldier, and not now. But the son was not finished. Straightening, he looked around the room again, his gaze sweeping over every officer present. "This ends here. But make no mistake, you will answer for what you've done. My mother deserves an apology. She deserves respect. And if you think I'll let this slide, you're wrong." His words landed heavy, leaving the officers silent. The weight of his presence lingered, and though no one dared to respond, they knew this man was not one to be ignored. For the elderly woman, the moment was bittersweet. She was free from the cuffs, yes, but the sting of injustice remained. Yet seeing her son standing there, fierce and unyielding, filled her with pride. He had become more than just her child. He was her protector, her shield. Her proof that dignity could still rise, even in the darkest of moments, and though the officers hadn't yet realized it, they had awakened something far more powerful than they imagined. The station grew unnaturally quiet. The kind of quiet that comes when men realize they are standing face to face with someone who will not be intimidated. The Green Beret stood tall in the center of the room, his broad shoulders squared, his presence filling the space like a storm. His mother sat close by, her hands folded on her lap, eyes fixed on him. She had endured humiliation and pain, but now she drew strength from the man in front of her. He was her son, yes, but in that moment, he was something greater, a force of justice. The senior officer, a man with years of experience behind the badge, finally cleared his throat. He stepped forward, trying to reassert authority. "Sir," he began, his tone firm but noticeably strained. "I understand you're upset. But we were following procedure." She fit the description, procedure. The Green Beret interrupted, his voice calm but razor-sharp. He took one step closer, and the officer instinctively straightened, as though preparing for impact. "Your procedure is to put handcuffs on a 76-year-old woman without proof. Your procedure is to drag an innocent grandmother into a station and treat her like a criminal in front of her neighbors." The officer opened his mouth to respond, but the soldier's eyes stopped him cold. They weren't just eyes. They were the eyes of a man who had seen war, who had buried brothers in arms, who had stood in places where procedure was the difference between life and death. "You don't know who you're dealing with," another officer muttered under his breath. Perhaps trying to regain a sense of control, the Green Beret's head turned slowly in his direction. His voice dropped lower, but it carried across the room like thunder. "No, it's you who doesn't know who you're dealing with." The tension thickened. Every officer in the room felt it. They saw it in his stance, in the controlled fury in his words. This was not an ordinary man. This was someone who lived by a code far stricter than theirs. Someone who had carried the weight of missions that most of them could not even imagine. "I've stood across from men with rifles pointed at my chest," he continued. His tone measured, his gaze unwavering. "I've faced enemies who wanted nothing more than to see me dead. And I didn't flinch. Do you think for 1 second I'll flinch when my own mother is humiliated by those sworn to protect her?" Silence. Heavy, suffocating silence. His mother, sitting quietly, felt her heart swell with pride. She had always known her son was strong. But to see him here, not in a battlefield, but in a police station, channeling that same strength to defend her, was overwhelming. The senior officer tried again, his voice quieter this time. "Look, we may have acted too quickly. But mistakes happen too quickly." The Green Beret snapped. His voice rose just enough to cut through the entire room. "Mistakes happen on a battlefield, and they cost lives. You don't get to use mistakes as an excuse when you place your hands on my mother and strip her of her dignity." One younger officer shifted nervously, glancing at the bruises still visible on the old woman's wrists. He whispered to another, guilt already settling in. The ripple of shame began to spread through the room, though few dared to speak it aloud. The Green Beret leaned forward slightly, his voice softer now, but far more dangerous. "You want to talk about procedure? Let me tell you what I know about procedure. Procedure means you confirm before you accuse. It means you protect the weak, not prey on them. It means you respect your elders, not parade them like criminals. That's procedure. What you did today was cowardice, not duty." His words cut deeper than any shout could. They weren't the words of a man venting rage. They were the words of a man who had earned the right to speak about honor, respect, and duty because he had lived them. Finally, his mother spoke, her voice soft but clear. "Son," she said, her hand trembling as she reached out to touch his arm. "I'm all right now. He looked down at her, and in that instant, the soldier in him gave way to the sun. His eyes softened, his jaw unclenched. He placed his hand gently over hers, nodding once. "You shouldn't have to be all right after this," he murmured, turning back to the officers. He straightened again, his presence filling the room. "This will not be forgotten," he declared. "You may think this ends here, but it doesn't. My mother deserves an apology. Not tomorrow. Not in a report." Now, the demand hung in the air like a challenge. The senior officer swallowed hard, then glanced at his men. The weight of guilt was too heavy to deny. Slowly, he turned back to the elderly woman, his voice reluctant but sincere. "Ma'am," he said, lowering his head slightly, "we're sorry. We were wrong." The apology was quiet, almost reluctant, but it was a start. The old woman met his eyes, then nodded once, her dignity intact despite everything. Her son didn't smile, didn't soften. He simply placed a steady hand on her shoulder and looked back at the officers one last time. "You will remember this day," he said, his tone final. "Not because you made a mistake, but because you learned what honor truly means." And with that, he guided his mother toward the door. Every officer watched as they left, the weight of the confrontation lingering in the air long after the door closed behind them. For the woman, the ordeal had been humiliating. But for the officers, it had become a lesson they would never forget. And for the son, the Green Beret was simply another battle won. Not on foreign soil, but on the streets of his own home. Asterisk as the heavy door closed behind the Green Beret and his mother. Silence flooded the station like a tide. No one spoke. The officers who had once stood so firm in their authority now shifted uneasily, their earlier confidence replaced by doubt. The old woman's bruised wrists and the decorated soldier's words hung in the air, echoing louder than any siren ever could. But outside those walls, something else was happening. The scene that had unfolded on the street earlier had not been forgotten. Neighbors who had witnessed the elderly woman being led away in handcuffs had gathered in small clusters. Word spread quickly, as it always did in tight-knit communities. By the time the soldier brought his mother out of the station, a small crowd had formed. Some carried their phones, video recordings already circulating. Others carried nothing but their outrage and disbelief. They had seen her that morning, smiling, carrying her groceries. They had watched her kindness for years. And now they were witnesses to her humiliation. As she stepped outside with her son by her side, the crowd moved closer. There were murmurs, gasps, and even tears from those who had known her longest. A neighbor spoke first, a man in his 50s who had seen everything. "She didn't do anything wrong," he said loudly, his voice trembling with anger. "I watched the whole thing. She was coming back from the market. They put cuffs on her like she was some criminal. Others joined in. I saw it too." A young woman called out, holding up her phone. "I recorded it." They didn't even give her a chance to explain. The soldier listened, his jaw tight, his eyes scanning the group. His mother clutched his arm gently, overwhelmed by the show of support. The shame she had felt earlier now mixed with gratitude. She was not alone. The truth was no longer hers to defend, it belonged to everyone who had seen it. Inside the station, officers peeked through the blinds, their expressions grim. The voices outside grew louder, stronger, undeniable. The truth, once confined to a single frightened woman, now stood on the steps of their station, backed by a crowd armed not with weapons, but with proof. The senior officer finally stepped outside, his face tight with discomfort. He tried to maintain composure, but the murmurs grew louder the moment he appeared. The crowd pressed forward, demanding answers. The Green Beret stood tall, his presence commanding even in the chaos. "These people saw it," he said firmly, gesturing to the witnesses. "They know my mother was innocent. They know the humiliation she endured. There's no hiding from this now. The old woman looked at the faces around her neighbors. Friends, even strangers, each of them carrying pieces of her truth. Tears welled in her eyes, not from weakness, but from the overwhelming power of solidarity. She had felt small in that interrogation room, but now, standing among her people, she felt stronger than ever. The young woman with the phone stepped closer. "I have it all recorded," she said, holding her device high. "Everything. The way they grabbed her, the way they cuffed her, the way she begged them to listen." The officer froze, realizing the weight of what that meant. No denial, no excuse could erase the evidence that now existed. The truth was no longer a matter of opinion, was undeniable. The soldier's voice cut through the crowd, deep and unyielding. "You see, officers, this isn't just about my mother anymore. This is about respect, about accountability. You can't erase what you did. You can't silence the voices of an entire community." The senior officer's shoulders slumped. The authority he once wielded so easily now slipped through his fingers. He cleared his throat, his voice shaky. We made a mistake." The words were weak, almost drowned by the murmurs of the crowd. The Green Beret stepped closer, his eyes burning into the officers. "A mistake is forgetting a name. A mistake is a wrong turn. What you did was not a mistake, it was an abuse. And now the truth is out. Everyone here knows it." The officer dropped his gaze. The weight of guilt, of exposure, was too heavy to bear. Around him, his men shifted uncomfortably, their badges suddenly feeling like chains rather than shields. The elderly woman, still holding her son's arm, finally spoke. Her voice was soft, but it carried. "I have lived in this community for many years. I have seen children grow, families thrive, and neighbors stand together. But what I endured today was not justice. It was humiliation, and I will never forget it." Her words pierced the air. The crowd fell silent, listening with respect. The truth had found its voice not in anger, but in quiet dignity. Her son placed a hand on her shoulder, steadying her. "They tried to silence you, Mama," he said gently, his eyes sweeping over the crowd. "But now your voice is louder than ever, louder than their badges, louder than their excuses. And this truth will not fade." The witnesses nodded in agreement. Phones remained raised, capturing every word, every expression. This moment would not disappear. It would spread, carried by technology, by community, by the undeniable power of truth. The senior officer finally turned and walked back inside, his silence louder than any apology he could have offered. His men followed, their heads low. The confrontation was over, but the truth remained standing alive, unshakable. Undeniable, the elderly woman looked up at her son. Pride filled her eyes. She had been wronged, yes, but now she had been vindicated not only by her son's strength, but by the voices of everyone who had seen the truth with their own eyes. And in that moment, she realized something powerful. Injustice had tried to break her, but instead it had united her with those around her. And that unity was stronger than any set of handcuffs. The night air was cool as the Green Beret guided his mother gently down the steps of the police station. The crowd that had gathered didn't disperse. Instead, they followed quietly, as though escorting her back to the safety and respect she deserved. Neighbors walked beside her, some offering words of comfort, others simply walking in silence. Their presence was its own kind of shield, a living reminder that she was not alone. For the elderly woman, every step away from that station felt heavy but healing. She could still feel the sting of the metal cuffs on her wrists, the humiliation of being treated like a criminal. But alongside the pain was something new: strength. Not just her son's strength, though his presence had been her anchor, but the strength of an entire community that had stood up for her. When they reached her home, the porch light glowed warmly, welcoming her back. Neighbors lingered outside, some standing guard as if to ensure no harm would come to her again. She paused at the doorway, her groceries still scattered where she had dropped them earlier. The bread was flattened, the milk spilled, but she didn't care. She stepped inside, her son following closely, his watchful eyes scanning every corner as if protecting her from invisible enemies. Asterisk inside the modest home. She sat at her favorite chair by the window, the same place she had sat that morning with her tea. But the day had transformed. What began as ordinary had become extraordinary painful, yes, but also unforgettable. She looked at her son, who now stood silently, his hands on his hips, his chest rising and falling with controlled breaths. "Sit, son," she said softly. "You've done enough standing for one day." He gave a small smile, rare, but genuine, and pulled up a chair beside her. For a long moment, they simply sat together in silence. Then, he spoke. "Mama, what they did to you. It won't end here. I'll make sure of it. People will know. Those officers will be held accountable." His voice was steady, but beneath it was a fire that would not be extinguished. She reached out and placed her frail hand over his. "I know you will. But what matters most is that you came. You heard me, and you came." Her words pierced his heart. He had faced ambushes, explosives, and countless battles. But nothing had ever shaken him like the sound of his mother's voice asking for help. And nothing had ever filled him with such pride as hearing her speak now. Her dignity unbroken. The days that followed were unlike anything the neighborhood had ever seen. The video of her detainment spread quickly online, carried by the voices of witnesses who refused to stay silent. News crews arrived, reporters eager to tell the story of the elderly woman wrongfully detained and her son, the most decorated Green Beret alive, who had come to her defense. The police department, once silent, found itself under a spotlight it couldn't escape. Officials issued public apologies. Promises of reform and retraining were made. For the officers involved, the shame of their actions became inescapable. They weren't just dealing with an elderly woman, they had wronged the mother of a national hero. And that truth echoed across headlines and airwaves. But for the woman, the legacy of the incident wasn't about the apologies or the cameras. It was about the lesson it carried. She had seen firsthand how quickly dignity could be stripped away, and how easily authority could be abused. Yet she had also seen how truth, courage, and unity could rise up to meet injustice. Neighbors visited her daily, bringing meals, offering help, and thanking her for her quiet bravery. Young people in the community called her a grandmother to all, saying her resilience had given them courage too. What she had suffered became a symbol not of weakness, but of strength. Her son remained by her side as much as possible. He had fought many battles, but this one had been the most personal. And in defending her, he reminded the world of what true honor meant. His medals, his decorations, his military victories, they were all remarkable. But to him, the greatest honor was protecting the woman who had raised him. One evening, as they sat together once more by the window, she spoke softly. "Do you know what I see when I look back at all this?" He turned to her, waiting. "I see pain, yes. But I also see light. They tried to shame me, but instead, they revealed themselves. And they reminded me of something I've always known, that family and truth are stronger than any injustice." He nodded, his throat tightening. She had always had a way of putting wisdom into the simplest words. The legacy of that day lived on. It wasn't just a story told by neighbors or spread through social media. It became a reminder in the community of the importance of respect, especially for elders. Schools discussed it, churches spoke of it, and families told their children about the grandmother who stood tall even when humiliated, and the son who came like a warrior to defend her. The Green Beret knew that battles never truly ended. There was always another fight, another mission. But this one, the fight for his mother's dignity, would stay with him forever. It was a different kind of victory, one not measured in medals or ranks, but in love, loyalty, and justice. As for the elderly woman, she returned to her routines. She still woke early, still drank her tea by the window, still walked to the market when she could. But something had changed. When people greeted her now, there was a new layer of respect in their eyes. Not pity, not sorrow, respect. They saw her not as a victim, but as a survivor. As a woman whose story had touched lives far beyond her street. And each morning, as she glanced at the photo of her son in his uniform, she whispered the same words, "Thank you," not just for that day, but for every day he had been her shield, her pride, and her greatest legacy, because in the end, it wasn't only her story. It was theirs. A mother's quiet dignity and a son's unshakable courage, woven together into a legacy of resilience that no injustice could ever erase.